Yulanda Williams, thank you so much for joining me on this conversation. You're a retired 32-year veteran of the San Francisco Police Department, and you have a wealth of experience on community policing and understanding the intersection of how law enforcement works with other agencies, whether they're local or state or federal. And so we're going to have this conversation about how law enforcement works with the current immigration actions that are taking place around the country. So, correct me if I'm wrong about this. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you about the law enforcement aspect of this is because there's so many angles to the immigration action story, whether it's the protests or observers or U.S. citizens getting swept up, the extra aggressive actions right now of some of these actions in various communities. But not that much has been talked about in terms of local law enforcement. And for the past 15 years or so, it seems that there has been quite a lot of emphasis on community policing and building trust with these same communities that are experiencing these ICE actions right now. So, if you could paint a picture of what the cooperation or relationship has been between local law enforcement and DHS activities, whether it's ICE or Border Patrol prior to the past year, what has that looked like before?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we set the tone of this, which is first of all, Americans generally support the legal deportation of individuals who've entered the United States unlawfully, particularly those who have committed crimes. But there is a prevailing sense of frustration from many of our American citizens regarding the current enforcement of the immigration laws. For example, California, who requires that you can get, we used to have it where you required to be a United States citizen in order to be able to obtain a driver's license. However, people are frustrated because they're finding now that in California, in particular, you can get a driver's license regardless of your citizenship or your legality of being in the state of California. These, amongst other frustrations, have gotten us to the point where we are at now, where people believe the propaganda about let's make America great again. And the way for us to do it is to get rid of all of these illegal immigrants that are in the United States because they're the ones that are perpetrating the crime and everything else. But it raises important questions about the value and the significance of citizenship. And I think with all of these frustrations, we've wound up in this situation that we're in right now. It's led to confusion, perceptions of unfairness, and there has not been any clear, consistent immigration enforcement that respects the rules of the laws and the rights of individuals, human beings. And in order for this process to be more effective, there has to be a collaboration between ICE or Homeland Security and the local law enforcement agencies, which is a complex situation because there's multiple viewpoints. There's varying policies and procedures. However, we have to be able to come to some uniformed way to get whatever the mission is accomplished in a meaningful way that still will foster good relationships with all the parties that are involved. And I think right now we have a situation where there's too many internal problems that are existing. And then when there are internal problems
What type of
inherently
internal
involved,
problems?
well, ICE has their own policies and procedures, and many of these local law enforcement agencies have their own policies and procedures. So my primary concern is regarding the fact that we need to be able to compromise with one another. First, making safety, yes, the primary concern, as well as we have to remember that we have to continue to build strong relationships, transparent policies that respect our communities. And it's essential for us to do this in an environment where everyone feels safe and everyone feels heard. And these are the things that are lacking, not to mention the lack of accountability, real accountability when things go wrong.
So immigration activities were taking place prior to the current administration. What did that look like in terms of cooperation or relationship with local law enforcement before? Because it's called targeted enforcement, right? You have ICE, Border Patrol, whoever has a list of names and reasons why they are targeting a particular person for to detain them, to potentially deport them. What did that look like before?
Well, prior
Was
to
there
that, I think that
cooperation with?
yes, prior to that, I believe that ICE actually respected the policies and procedures of the local law enforcement agencies which they were entering into. And I think there was more of a respect between the two agencies. But right now, it seems like it's more of a competition to see who's the most powerful in its enforcement efforts. And in turn, the local law enforcement agencies are being disrespected as well as the people who are in those particular locations. The policies are not in alignment with one another. And we have to have an established relationship between Homeland Security and local law enforcement agencies that is clear in its communication methods, clear in its policies and procedures. Again, be respectful, and we have to define the roles and prioritize everything, in particular with community safety and trust. Because once ICE or Homeland Security enters into a community and does whatever it does and creates this pandemonium and this frustration builds up, we wind up in a situation where we're going to be looking back at something similar to the Watts riot, or we're going to be looking at something where we're going not forward, but we're moving backwards. And this is going to do more harm than good in the long run.
The new governor of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, just rescinded the previous Republican governor Youngkin's executive order with a new executive order stopping the deputization of state and local law enforcement to assist ICE in apprehending undocumented immigrants who have committed violent crimes in the past. She said that local agencies need to focus on their own investigative and community policing. Is that, in your mind, the right way to go to completely sever those ties with regard to violent crimes? Tell me what you think works with that or doesn't work.
Well, I think that the local law enforcement agencies and local cities have been pushed to the limit. And you cannot have a intruder enter into your jurisdiction and suddenly take over, because it leads to confusion. And we have to ensure that we allow the law enforcement, local law enforcement, and the locations where Homeland Security feels they need to have a presence, they have to be respectful of what is already in existence. Oftentimes, the intelligence that the local law enforcement agency has might be far more helpful to them. But the only way they can allow local enforcement to help them is they have to be respectful and try and build some type of relationship between local law enforcement agency and Homeland Security. And they have to make sure that it's going to be transparent in such a way that you can engage community leaders, you can engage advocacy groups, residents, and everyone can explain their roles, their concerns, and the policies can then be generated in a way that it reduces the fear and the misinformation. We have to prioritize the protection again of the public. We have to ensure that the law enforcement actions that we take do not make people fear or feel like they're in harm when they're in their respective communities or cities. Right now, people are fearful. A lot of people are carrying
Yeah.
additional identification on them because they don't know when they're going to be stopped or when they're going to be questioned. This is
Or
just
staying
another
home,
mechanism of a
frankly.
stop and frisk.
Right.
Yes, or
Right.
stay
Or I
at home,
mean,
exactly.
mostly
And
it's staying home. Yeah.
yeah, and the unfortunate thing is that Homeland Security does not necessarily understand the cultural competency of a community because they're not engaging with the community on a daily basis. They don't understand the training, the cultural sensitivity, the need for de-escalation. And I think this is where, if we were to do it the right way, it would be where we would say, okay, Homeland Security, you have to do joint training with local law enforcement agencies in the places where you think you need to have a presence. And whatever you're going to do, it has to be something that is a joint mission that still does not violate the policies, the principles, the guidelines of various communities, various cities, and everything. And there has to be an independent oversight. We have to establish some type of oversight in order to ensure that accountability and trust exists with the federal agents as well as our local law enforcement agencies. And without that, we can't do anything because what is going to happen is what we're seeing happening right now.
The reality, Yolanda, is that when the administration's stated goal is mass deportation and meeting certain quotas monthly, daily, is it not hard to establish that kind of relationship with local law enforcement, where is some level of cooperation in looking for people maybe with violent criminal histories, but not sweeping up others who have documents on some level and even U.S. citizens?
Well, it's like when the Secret Service comes with POTUS, they always have multiple meetings. Intelligence is provided from the federal level, and then also intelligence is provided from the local level. And they're very respectful of what local agencies have as far as knowledge and training within their respective locations. So if you can do that when it's time for POTUS to come in, what makes it so hard to do it in other instances? And the other thing is DHS comes in as a disruptive force, almost like a Gestapo. So all of a sudden you feel like you're in a city under siege or you're in a community that's under siege. So we have to make sure that everything is balanced in such a way that people can feel comfortable. I mean, why should you, even those who are here legally, feel that suddenly they have to change their life patterns, their lifestyles? They have to be concerned that they might be stopped or questioned about the
Yeah.
legitimacy of their existence. I mean, what was presented to us as an interest of trying to ensure that those who were here illegally and committing crimes and whatnot were going to be up for deportation has now become a free for all. And it's become far too much.
Yeah.
And so there must be a partnership between the two agencies, Homeland Security and local law enforcement agencies, because we are in a situation that is creating more harm and damage than good in the long run.
But given that it is unlikely that DHS is going to initiate that level of cooperation and that level of integration and transparency with local law enforcement, what do you think law enforcement should be doing right now? Local agencies, police departments, sheriff's departments, what should they be doing, given that that's the
Well,
situation in so many communities?
Well, in order for them not to be tied into this same stigma as Homeland Security has, I think that local law enforcement has to still stick by their policies and their procedures. They cannot compromise those things because once Homeland Security is gone, everything falls back on the local law enforcement agencies to deliver the goods and services and resources to their communities.
What does that look like in terms of actually communicating with communities? at this point?
Well, again, as I stated previously, I think we need to, as communities, request through local law enforcement agencies that there be more town hall meetings. The town hall meetings purposely for community residents, visitors, whomever, who want to be a part of a larger conversation. And that conversation needs to focus on roles. It needs to focus on transparency. It needs to focus on training and accountability. I think in general, if communities stand up, if certain cities and states begin to speak out, and we get these politicians to recognize that we're going down the wrong path, and we respect human beings and deliver services with dignity and respect, I think we can resolve a lot of the tension that currently is in existence.
Do you think that when community members are fighting against being detained, when they're trying to show their documentation and so on, but they're being taken into vans and so on, could their family members reach out to local law enforcement to help with stopping that from happening? In other words, local law enforcement is there to help the community when something is happening to them. To what extent can community members actually reach out to local law enforcement for help when they're feeling like they're being wrongfully detained?
Well, I know
Is there any help there?
I know the policy and procedure in San Francisco is that if someone wants to file a police report, you have to take that police report. So I think it behooves many of these family members to start filing police reports, documenting what happened, and when they can, film it with your cameras on your phone. If you can, and you have other witnesses that can attest to what happened, have them write out statements or draw up petitions. I mean, the power still is in the hands of the people when it's all said and done. And we have to just take back that power, but do it in such a way that we're not going to destroy property or be reckless or anything. We can do it in a peaceful, lawful manner and demand that we're protected.
Let's talk about the masking, because you and I have talked about this in the past, how you see here in California and a couple of other states now, the federal court has upheld the law that DHS agents need to be unmasked. How do you see that potential interaction down the road if they're skirting that new law of having to be unmasked? Would local law enforcement actually step in and try to enforce that law with these DHS agents?
Well, I think again, unfortunately, DHS is the federal government, but I will say this, no officer, no matter whom they're working for, should be able to be allowed to be masked. Because for me, a mask represents Ku Klux Klans. I mean, if you want to cover yourself up, you want to be able to do what you want to do, and then use your authority to rationalize what could be some form of racism or biases. And we know that this has been a problem throughout the history of local law enforcement, which is basically slave catchers. And what's happening right now with Homeland Security and ICE and everything else, it's slave catching. And this time, the driving force is to go after those who are from one specific culture. And if they can get away with it with this culture, which culture is going to be next? And who's going to be next after that? And that's what we have
Well,
to be cautious of.
let's, in that vein, then let's talk about Minneapolis. And I want to read, first of all, some of the DHS guidelines on use of force because of what happened in Minneapolis with the shooting of a local and a community observer there. And the DHS guideline says officers may use deadly force only when the law enforcement officer has a reasonable belief that the subject of such force poses an imminent threat of death or seriously bodily serious bodily harm to the officer or to another person. And then it goes on to say, with regard to a subject potentially fleeing, deadly force shall not be used solely to prevent the escape of a fleeing subject. However, deadly force is authorized to prevent the escape of the fleeing subject where the officer has a reasonable belief that they would pose a significant threat of death or serious physical harm. When you saw the videos of what had transpired there in Minneapolis with Renee Good's shooting, what did you think? What did you see?
Well, my first thoughts were in alignment with what the policy is that you just read, which is generally a policy for use of force in many agencies and the policy when it comes to the use of deadly force. First and foremost, as a law enforcement officer or just a human being, if you see a motorized vehicle coming in your direction, why would you stand there when if you have an opportunity to move out of the area? That's the first thing. The second thing is understanding is the if you move out of the area which you can be harmed by this moving vehicle, if you move out of that area and you allow the person who is driving to go to their destination? Is there going to be any real threat or harm to anyone else by you allowing that person to flee? And what truly was their intent to begin with? What was their presence? Were you able to secure the license plate number of the car? That's why we have DMV records so that you can find out where the vehicle is registered to and to whom it's registered to. And these are first questions that came to mind when I saw this. And what was the reason for the drawing of your firearm?
Right.
Why did you not think of something less lethal? Why didn't you think of moving out of the area where the vehicle was driving?
What was your thought of him pulling out his own phone to record in one hand, leaving the other hand free to draw the weapon, and the recording itself, doing that recording itself? What was your thought as an officer?
As an officer, I would be concerned about the adrenaline rush and the fact that all of a sudden tunnel vision comes in. You're not hearing things and necessarily you're not seeing things as they really might be occurring because things are moving at a much faster pace at that point. Is it possible that when he had the camera in one hand and the gun in the other hand, he may have accidentally pulled the trigger without intending to do so, thinking that that may have been the phone in the hand? I mean, there are multiple things that come into mind. And if you had an opportunity and you had the wherewithal to use your phone to record this engagement or this encounter, then why was it necessary to have the gun out? I mean, if you're focused in on someone who is actually trying to do you harm, if you have recorded that, you can use it at a later time. Was the fleeing person shooting at you? Did they have a firearm? I mean, there's so many questions that come into play. And that's why I said it's very important in a situation like this that there be multiple investigations occurring, not just
Right.
Homeland
But DOJ
Security
will
or
not
ICE
be
investigating.
right. But Dina's point.
Exactly. And because they're failing to investigate leads me to the belief that you're trying to protect police officers who violated or potentially violated your policies and your own procedures. Why would you give police immunity to someone who has acted or engaged in a mannerism which violates your policies and procedures and what a reasonable person may have done in that same situation? That's the real test. What would a reasonable officer have done given those same factors? What would have occurred? You have a police radio. Why didn't you go out on the air with your police radio and ask for maybe local law enforcement to stop that particular driver or to go to the residence where this particular car was registered to so that you could later engage in a conversation? Or if you had to cite this person or even if you had to arrest them, you could have done it in a way which would have saved potentially a life.
But Yolanda, this is where it gets into the whole issue of mission creep with regard to ICE agents, with Border Patrol agents. To what extent is it part of their mission to engage in any way with, U.S. citizen observers or protesters, people who they're not targeting? when they're in that community?
I
Because
don't think that their training focuses on that. And I think that's the flaw in their training of their officers, that they have not really had a opportunity to learn how to just deal with people in normal day-to-day conversations and communications. And I think that's where local law enforcement could help them in doing a better job that the optics look like they're trying to do their job with a policy and procedure in mind and not being, again, the driving force that is coming in and uprooting people legally and illegally in whatever mannerism they choose to do so. I mean, you just can't have that.
when you see the myriad videos around the country, a lot in Minnesota right now, in Minneapolis, in Santa Ana, California, in Los Angeles, in New York, in New Jersey, Chicago, what does that tell you about their training in general? And as a 32-year veteran, you're seeing how these actions are being implemented. What does that tell you generally about ICE agents and Border Patrol agents training in these situations?
They need far more training in community relations. They need far more training in how to verbally engage with members of the public and how to de escalate situations. So I think they need to focus more on de escalation tactics. And like I said before, the firearm should be the very last thing that they consider using when they're encountering individuals, especially those who you come across who are, say, protesters or onlookers. But unfortunately, Homeland Security officers, I believe, have been given a false sense of protection under the police immunity, which can become extremely problematic and lead to more situations of this kind across the United States. And we have to be cautious and careful about that because ultimately it could be a very costly undertaking.
Cost,
Not only
right.
costly as far as the tragedy that happens with the families because of the loss of their loved ones, but financially costly because lawsuits will be brought up against multiple agencies, multiple individuals. I mean, this is just outrageous and it's ludicrous. We need to change our course. We need to go back to the drawing board and start out with some clear guidelines that will allow things to occur in an orderly fashion and not put any particular person in harm.
To what extent is local law enforcement obligated to help protesters in those circumstances to maintain their First Amendment rights? And what rights do observers have in terms of videotaping ICE actions and being there in the neighborhood, in the vicinity to observe, to support their neighbors as they'd like, and to express their own First Amendment rights?
Well,
What's that intersection there? Yeah.
first and foremost, onlookers have the right to capture video footage, photos, document whatever it is that they choose to do so, as long as they don't try and take back someone who is being legally arrested by any particular law enforcement. Secondly, in these type of situations, law enforcement has a responsibility to protect onlookers and protesters to ensure that they are safe and that no one violates their policies and procedures. And so the local law enforcement agencies are being put in a difficult situation because they're looking at these other agencies that are not part of their community coming in, as I stated before, like a driving force, and they are acting without any consequences. That creates a whole nother gamut. Because if local law enforcement starts to see others come in and be able to do as they please with no accountability and no actions taken against them, well, then what is the perception then? Are we really moving forward or are we reverting back to old tactics? I mean,
Well,
we have
when you see DHS agents using on video chemical agents to stop protesters, pulling them out of their vehicles, and so on. The thought is, well, maybe local law enforcement can be there to protect the rights of those protesters. We're not necessarily seeing that. How proactive should those local agencies be?
Well, I mean, again, that's based on their actual personnel. Do they have enough personnel to be in all these different locations when these things are occurring? But at the same time, I think one thing that we can, as a community, mandate that the DHS and ICE officers all have to wear body worn cameras and they have
Mhm.
to be turned on at all times. And there has to be consequences if we find out that they were not turned on. So that would be one of the things that we can also make certain we can do because the videos don't lie. But when you don't have a video, then it's just his story versus her story versus somebody else's story. And I think that's what we need to look at as well, because local law enforcement agencies, as far as I know, all local law enforcement agencies now have cameras on the officers themselves and also on the vehicles that they're operating. And I think that these technology is not anything new and it shouldn't be perceived as new to Homeland Security. It should be perceived as new to ICE. But we need to make sure that they are in compliance too. And I'm sorry, the DOJ got this one wrong because the DOJ should allow the local law enforcement agency to do their investigations and their due diligence as well. This needs to be a multi-agent investigation, a multi-agency investigation so that we
Well,
can make sure everything is transparent and we can make sure that there are no biases because you cannot expect good outcomes if you have the same agency who created the harm investigating the harm. That makes no sense.
well, there are members of Congress who are trying to write those body cameras into bills right now as part of DHS guidelines. So we'll see where that goes. Yolanda,
Wonderful.
the administration has now threatened the Insurrection Act in Minnesota. The Pentagon has put on standby 1,500 U.S. troops out of 2 battalions in Alaska. It's essentially potentially a soup of various agencies that have lethal weapons in the midst of people's lives and communities there. How can people in the community, assuming it even comes to pass in that way, right? That there are even US troops on top of the state National Guard, on top of all the other various law enforcement agencies. How would you advise for people to navigate all of this safely while maintaining their rights to protest, to observe?
Well, again, like I say, I would not go anywhere unaccompanied by someone else that was with me. So if you're going to decide to go out and protest or go out to see what's going on at these various locations where Homeland Security officers are posted, have at least one person with you. So whatever you're doing, they can be your additional eyes and ears. Most times when there's demonstrations and different things like that, law enforcement agencies will have one officer that's maintaining the visual while the other one is doing the engagement. And I would suggest for the general public that you go in twos or threes and you make sure at all times somebody is documenting either with their cameras or documenting in writing what is going on so that you have this information because it's hard to argue when you've got something visually that you can show someone that can demonstrate what it is that you're trying to explain that happened that should be alarming or of concern. But when you're by yourself and you're trying to do this on your own, it's very hard to navigate. And then if something happens to you, who is going to be a witness to the occurrence? And that's just the unfortunate thing because a lot of times you can have officers that have gone rogue. And there can be rogue officers in ICE, rogue officers in Homeland Security. I mean, they're not exempt from it. And there could be rogue military officers. if we don't start to set some parameters and some rules and regulations and guidelines, we are going to wind up with an internal war right here in the United States, let alone what's happening outside of the United States. But here within the United States, there is going to be some long, hard fights ahead. And so the only thing we can do at this point is to be there, be present, and document things as they are occurring.
Well, given that those parameters are unlikely at this point to come from the federal government, to what extent is local law enforcement, local agencies, mayors, whoever, people within those specific communities obligated to be proactive to establish whatever kind of parameters they think they can establish for the community's safety at this point?
Well,
Because
I
that's
think
really what it comes down to is people are feeling tremendous fear, they're feeling the tremendous chaos, they're feeling tremendous lack of safety. So who can take responsibility for helping the community feel safer at this point, given the situation and the reality as it is?
Well, it's got to be the local jurisdiction. And I think one thing that might also be considered is to have some type of hot tip line that is just specifically for that purpose and that purpose only. And each agency should perhaps consider having some officers who are responsible to be the rapid deployment that goes to a location if someone is
Right.
indicating that they think the civil rights of an individual is being violated or that an officer is exercising too much force on an individual. We have to be able to have local law enforcement to make sure that they are accessible, available, and on site to stop the attack. It may mean that there becomes a standoff between local law enforcement and ICE or Homeland Security, but be it
Yeah.
as it may, that is what it is because local law enforcement is sworn to protect and serve the residents and those who are within their jurisdiction. And they have to maintain that. The mayor has that responsibility. All of the local law, all of the local cities, counties, and states have that responsibility. And so we cannot push that over to Homeland Security because Homeland Security is not going to be around when, let's say, a new administration comes into play. You get a new president, there's going to be new perceptions, new goals, new objectives, everything. And so, this is why it is important for our local law enforcement agencies to continue to maintain their communication and continue to foster trusting relationships with those
Yeah.
who live in their jurisdiction and not become involved in the tactics of ICE and Homeland Security. I applaud those states and those cities that say we're not going to work with ICE to do what we feel is absolutely inhumane. We have to deliver service that we can be proud of. We have to deliver service that is meaningful and respectful. And until such time that that becomes the mannerism in which these other agencies that are being sent to various states and cities and communities, until they do that, we can't work with them because just because you see a blue uniform doesn't mean that that's a broad brush that you place on and paint on everyone. However, if as a local law enforcement agency, if you don't disassociate yourself with the antics of Department of Homeland Security, the antics of ICE, then you become part of the problem as well. And we just can't have that type of unrest.
So, what would you say if you can give a message to police chiefs and sheriffs around the country in areas where ICE action is hitting those communities especially hard, Yolanda? What would you say to them right now?
That I applaud them for standing their grounds if they have made their decisions not to work with these agencies. I would say to them that it requires joint training. It requires accountability across the board. And if they can't be respectful and hold themselves accountable for things that happen that shouldn't be occurring, then the ultimate responsibility of all who are empowered in these local cities and states and whatnot to do what they must do to protect those who live in those respective locations. And I would say to them is that my proposal would be for them to consider having many town hall meetings with those who have experienced horrible outcomes. Maybe not as horrific as what happened in Minnesota, but still, if they've had some type of horrific outcome, that's trauma. We need to find a way to get this resolved in a way in which everyone is respected. We have to have safeguards in place. That's why we have mayors. That's why we have chiefs of police. That's why law enforcement agencies have supervisors and managers and whatnot. Is that's to avoid these type of situations, which become costly and long-term cost that don't necessarily have to even occur if we would just use our heads and remember that everything we do, for every act we commit, there is a reaction. And I think that's what has been forgotten because, again, you've given the authority to these people to take away the rights and freedoms of others. You have to be cautious and careful. That's why there's a constitution. That's why there are policies and procedures. No, it doesn't mean that that's the ultimate end all be all, but it's a guideline to make sure that everyone feels like they have a seat at the table.
And the other thing too, Yolanda, is when I look at any story, I look at where is the humanity being uplifted or being depressed.
Yeah.
And in this case, there are certain elements that doesn't seem to matter. But for those for whom it does, would you say that they need to take a more active role and
Well,
either speak out more or do something more like you're saying, town halls? I mean, to me, that's always the crux of a story. That's always a crux of an issue, is where the humanity is.
exactly. The respect for human life and humanity is the overall goal. The paramilitary actions of ICE and Homeland Security is placing all of our cities, all of our states under siege. And of course, it's leading to the protests, the violence, and the widespread chaos. And these operations, as we all know, are directed by our commander in chief. And we're in grave risk of igniting a conflict that is going to be with us for decades. And we cannot allow these oppressive, barbaric tactics to be utilized on unsuspecting individuals. And so the responsibility, unfortunately, is inherently on these cities and these states to keep their people safe, to ensure that we all have the rights and opportunities that are guaranteed by the Constitution. Right now, the Constitution is come into question on every platform. Things we hear on a daily basis, changing, changing. And so it almost makes you feel like just because I'm a United States citizen, am I really protected or do I have to also be worried?
Well,
Because today they
that is
may
the
not be
case
coming for
for
you.
many U.S. citizens now.
Yeah, yeah. They may not be coming for you today, but what about tomorrow? What does tomorrow hold?
So more being proactive and more town halls and more engaging with the community for local leaders, local law enforcement at this point is what you're
Absolutely,
saying.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. There's no way around it. We have to build up those type of safeguards so that we can ensure that our core principles are respected.
Yolanda, we'll see where things lead. Thank you so
Yes.
much for your perspective. You've had so many years of community policing experience yourself there in San Francisco. So your perspective, your experience around this
Well,
is
thank
invaluable.
you. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
having me on your show. And,
Thanks.
again, I appreciate the fact that you are engaging with others about this very important conflict that currently exists. And I wish you and your listeners well, and be safe.
Yeah, may we all be safe. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks, Yolanda. We'll see you
Bye-bye now.
soon. Bye.
Okay.